confronted with or based on empirical findings. So among these layers, I'll focus on the middle one, the one that's kind of in italics, the sort of idea that scientists themselves, experimental philosophers, all have certain methodological views that they defend. So they have this sort of conceptualization of what these procedures are there for. How do you justify them so that you can kind of trust more or less kind of their results and secure those empirical results. So I want to focus on this sort of middle layer, particularly just again using a bit of a quote from someone a bit wiser than me. I want to flag that scientists themselves take both descriptive and critical perspectives on the methods discourse, and in particular on these commitments. So sometimes you'll find certain commitments to a certain practices or certain procedure, like plainly described, and they will play a descriptive but also sort of a normative role, as I'll kind of soon emphasize. And sometimes there's a lot of critical conversation around why certain procedures should be accepted or not. As again, Shikora says, experimenters' pronouncements and commitments relating to methods are sometimes, but not always, accompanied by explicit reflections on and justifications and defenses of methods, techniques, and methodologies. And this applies to broader commitments to experimentalism that are at times explicitly defended. Specific methodological strategies are singled out and bolstered with supportive arguments, and even the proper ways of writing about methods-related issues might become a theme for critical reflection. And I think this is the case with respect to construct validity, or with respect to the procedures involved in construct validation. So I want to focus on the role that these procedures have in methods discourse. So the methodological discourse in psychology, in psychometrics, I'll tell you a bit more about it, gives a particular characterization of these validation methods or procedures. And I want to reflect on that. And when I say why focus on methods discourse? I am not doing any sort of Derridian sort of kind of discourse analysis, but rather I think that looking at the discourse of scientists about why certain methods are better, how can we justify them better, why should we trust their results, is a very straightforward route to investigating scientific practice. But more importantly, it kind of showcases a normative character of science, which is kind of Sober is putting it, is full of directives concerning how nature ought to be studied. So science is not just sort of descriptive. So when you have biologists don't just describe living things, they constantly evaluate each other's work. Why, again, focus on this sort of normative dimension of science? Because I think if we are reminded of that normative dimension of science, we can see our own work as philosophers as being the continuation of that normative work. So rather than seeing a normative sort of project proposed by philosophers as being one that's kind of just bit of hubris, let us as philosophers tell you what you should do as scientists. I think a more productive way of presenting our normative ambitions and our normative contributions from the philosophy side is to say, look, it's in the continuation of what science is doing. And I think by thinking about methods discourse with specific, as a specific focus, like I'm proposing here, is in a way serving this purpose, showing why the type of tame normative ambitions that I'm having from this project are actually in the continuation of scientific work being carried out, rather than imposed from outside, from a sort of philosophical analysis that has some trouble linking to the actual scientific practice. Okay, so this has been so far a very general motivation of the direction I'm coming at in thinking about the notion of construct validation. So the focus, I want to focus on methods discourse in psychology, even more specifically on the case of psychometric validation. Why? Methods discourse that emphasizing experimental kind of laboratory research has played historically and contemporarily a key role in establishing psychology as a science, as a hard science. And you have both psychologists and philosophers explicitly addressing, challenging, defending some of these assumptions like pronouncement commitments relating to methods, and even the more general interpretations or stances on experimentalism. So you have this joint effort to engage with method discourse at kind of different layers, as I kind of emphasized in the quote from Shikore. Now, the case of psychometrics, I think it's interesting. It kind of provides a certain approach to measuring quantitative psychological attributes like intelligence, personality traits, happiness, well-being. So psychometrics within psychology, if you want to kind of look at it as a discipline, it's one that kind of embodies these sorts of commitments of the method discourse. So if the method discourse in psychology in general kind of emphasizes the role of experimental research, quantitative research for establishing psychology as a science, psychometry does that in one of the most direct ways possible. So I think focusing on psychometrics and on the methods discourse in psychometrics makes sense in this sort of for this very general motivation. And in particular within psychometrics, so it's a lot of layering here, I apologize. Within psychometrics, I want to look at the notion of psychometric validation. Arguably, validation or validity is one of the most fundamental and controversial issues in psychological measurements, and I'll hope to be able to illustrate today with a couple of examples of why that is so. So in a way, focusing on validation in methods discourse is not focusing on any sort of corner of the methodological discourse in psychology. It's rather focusing on a very important part of this discourse and showing what the role it plays in the broader practice, and how that influences what psychology is, what sort of knowledge it kind of delivers, and what sort of progress is possible in psychology. So that was kind of the motivation of the focus, methods discourse within psychology, because traditionally the methods discourse has played an important role in trying to establish psychology as a hard science. Also within psychology, I want to focus on psychometrics and on the notion of validation within psychometrics. And because I might confuse you on several occasions during this talk, I thought kind of a map for orientation purposes might be helpful, also to remind myself what I'm trying to achieve here. So I will tell you a bit about what is so special on psychometric approaches to measuring the mind. Let's put it in bold terms, measuring the mind. Then I want to show how the problem of validity arises in psychometrics, how it has been conceived in the method discourse historically, and how it is kind of presented now. I also talk a bit about validity concepts. I'm not going to spend as much time as I want on kind of all distinguishing a wide range of kind of validity concepts that are used within psychometrics and kind of psychological research more generally, but rather I want to focus hopefully in support of my argument on this distinction between predictive and construct validity. This is a distinction that's being flagged by both psychologists and philosophers as being one of the contemporary most important distinctions. And then kind of returning to this sort of idea that out of these validity concepts, there's a special role that is assigned to the concept of construct validity within the methods discourse of psychometrics. And I'll kind of rush you through, is more likely said, sort of three cases where we can raise this concern or these troubles about construct validation in practice, and then sketch what I think, wishful thinking, comes out as kind of the pillars of a sort of a revolution concerning the way we think about construct validity. And I wasn't sure whether revolution or reform is the better term, because this sort of revolution that I'm going to suggest is kind of more kind of going back to the roots. It's kind of reversing, going back, looking back historically of what was there planned in the methods discourse about the notion of construct validity. So returning there rather than coming up with a totally new idea. So it's kind of a bit of, I think, as a philosophical contribution, is kind of learning from the practice and kind of trying to resolve some contemporary sorts of issues by using those lessons from this kind of historical inspection of the methods discourse. Okay, so I'll tell you a bit more about the case of psychometrics for those of you who browse psychometric journals regularly. This will be quite uninformative, but I thought kind of giving a bit of outline of what are the key ideas about the practice of psychometrics and of how the notion of validity, in particular construct validity, appears in this domain might be instructive and supportive of some of the claims I want to make with respect to the case studies. So that's my kind of motivation for this general introduction. So as a general discipline, psychometrics can be said to be concerned with measurement and prediction of psychological traits, aptitude, behaviors. The term aptitudes is used quite often in this literature. I mean, from this general characterization, say, therefore, is relevant to so many domains, scientific psychology, educational measurement traditionally, and even society in general. However, the public image of psychometrics is a very different one. It's a kind of a fairly technical discipline that's organized around the analysis of psychometric test data. I'll tell you in a moment a bit more about that is. But from this general characterization, I want to establish that there are at least two images or two ways to characterize psychometrics. One, the narrow one that I flagged towards the end of the my previous slide, is a discipline concerned with the construction of quite abstract statistical models that can be used in psychological research, but need not have particular interpretations in terms of specific psychological attributes. And the focus in this discipline, if you judge by the journals publishing in this, it's on developing very technical aspects of these statistical models, methods for parameter estimation or models, methods for model fit assessment and so on. So in this way, psychometrics can be seen as some philosophers have recently pointed as quite kind of close in spirit, although bracketing some differences, to kind of the representational theory of measurement. At least in the sort of, not necessarily disconnected from substantive questions within psychology, but rather seen as a tool for doing research in psychology, applicable to certain cases, but maybe not generally, and or maybe not even for the cases that historically has been used to apply for. So there is this understanding of the discipline as a set of formal tools, and mainly concerned with refining these formal tools. And then the more general sort of understanding of psychometrics that I will assume throughout this talk is looking at the discipline as being concerned with the application of these technical models to some construct of interest. Cognitive abilities like intelligence, mathematical abilities or personality traits, or even psychological disorders. So I don't think the two characterizations of the discipline are kind of antagonistic, or they are not kind of rule each other out. But for different purposes, it's worth kind of pointing one of the characterization as being the salient one or the second. And again, I think most of the remarks I want to make about the methods discourse, especially the historical ones, kind of make more sense if we take into account this sort of second sort of characterization of psychometrics as a discipline having applications within other areas of psychology, applications to kind of wider domains to society like policymaking, economic policymaking, education policymaking, and so on. Now, the following remarks, I take them to apply to both characterizations of psychometrics, but because in the both guises, it's an approach to measurement. And as an approach to measurement, psychometrics starts off by describing a target construct, which is the latent variable of interest, intelligence, some personality trait, then proposes a measure, typically in the form of a questionnaire of that particular construct. And it's also common practice to specify what are the independent variables that are taken to be relevant for predicting, or if you are optimistic, explaining the observed test scores, and also to offer some sort of model or some set of assumptions, typically substantive assumptions that are domain specific to support the inference about how those independent variables combine to produce, if again you're optimistic about causality here, or predict the observed score. So I take these to be very general outlines of the practice of psychometrics as an approach to measurement. So what are psychological measures? They're items that typically take the form of questions posed to test subjects. So if you take the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales, this includes questions about how to correctly continue a sequence of symbols. Or if you take another example I'll mention in this talk, Hood's Mysticism Scale, this includes a series of questions about a person's subjective spirituality that are grouped among different sorts of dimensions. Or if you take the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, among other things, this includes questions addressed to clinicians that have to rate how sad a patient appears on a scale from 0 to 6. Now, when a new test is built, psychometricians select items and formulate these questions, so that the test as a whole, or if you want the total score of the test, allows one to make useful predictions or inferences about the latent variable, the attribute of interest, be it intelligence, depression, or spirituality. So that means that a good psychometric test of a certain attribute X is one which allows the researchers to infer from the subject responses something about the target psychological attribute X. So notice again, this characterization of what it means to be a good psychometric test kind of focuses, it's more in line with the second characterization of kind of viewing psychometrics as a sort of applied or applicable type of set of tools rather than to the purely technical kind of understanding of psychometrics as a set of statistical models. Okay, now accepting a psychometric measure as being adequate and useful depends on whether the measure passes a series of tests, which are typically kind of bundled up together, referred to as measure validation. Typically including running the test on a group of people and doing statistical analysis of their responses. And the main approaches that I won't get into any details here, but if you have favorites, I'm kind of expecting everyone will favor item response theory, but there are these two approaches, the classical test theory and item response theory. Not much will depend on kind of choosing one approach or the other for the type of arguments I want to make about the notion of construct validation in the talk. But I may be wrong about that, and if you think I'm wrong about that, please flag it. And if you can explain why you think the difference between these approaches will make a difference in the type of argument I'm trying to convince you of. Okay, so another sort of to that kind of background question that I keep getting, why focus on this measurement approach? Why is it interesting? And why should we care about the problem of validation in this particular context rather than in other areas of psychology? And I think I want to flag at least 2 points of why the case of psychometrics is interesting. The third one is kind of, to my surprise, and also it was a good surprise, more and more philosophers are paying attention to it. So I think it's kind of important practice. But irrespective of the growing interest among philosophers for this discipline, I think there are these two facts which sometimes are not as widely acknowledged. One, psychometrics is kind of and has been traditionally a practical approach to measuring the mind, or psychological attributes if you don't want to go for the very fancy measuring the mind general characterization. So psychometric measurements are widely used in many decision-making contexts. So understanding them, understanding the practice and understanding why we measure and what we measure is important for understanding kind of what sort of evidence our decisions are based on, be it kind of decision-making with respect to drug testing or to education and economic policy making, or even an advertisement, if you want to understand a bit better target advertisement from data collected on Facebook, that sort of thing. So kind of paying attention to the practice of psychometric measurements. It's not just an kind of an exercise that has to do with kind of curiosity about technical developments, but it has a sort of further implication in understanding a bit more what lies behind some of kind of these decision-making scenarios. Also, it's kind of another issue that has been flagged quite recently is that psychometrics, a bit like statistics, because it has this sort of characterization as a discipline that's very technical, has been presented very often as being this sort of value-free type of psychological discipline. And more recently, it has been flagged by a series of authors that there are distinctive values that seem to be upheld within the practice of psychometrics that, again, show it as being of philosophical interest in raising, if you want, complementary sorts of questions about how these values influence the types of models we accept in different situations. So there is, so the primary sort of motivation that I was putting forward here is that there might be a more general interest in understanding how psychometrics works and what is kind of what are the fundamental sorts of questions that we should ask about the practice of psychometrics here, because psychometrics has this sort of practical sort of relevance. I won't insist too much on that, but I think it's kind of an important thing to flag. The other relevance for focusing on psychometrics is that within the methods discourse of psychometrics, there is, I think, a substantial amount of attention and argument being paid to trying to articulate the link or a bridge between theory and measurement in psychology. So it kind of provides an interesting ground for thinking about this general question. What is the link between measurement and theory in psychology? Looking within psychometrics, we get certain answers that might not generalize across the practice of different domains in psychology and different ways of doing sort of psychology scientifically, but I do think they're still kind of important lessons. And this, despite currently limited involvement of some of like psychometric measures in substantive psychological research. Okay, so that's why you should care about psychometrics. And as I said, I have kind of a special slide flagging that this interest in psychometrics and how an investigation of the practice of psychometrics can inform our philosophical debates can be done has been a topic of interest to some philosophers who have looked about how the practice of psychometrics and its epistemic challenges can give us insight to current debates about measurement, about modeling, about concept formation. And some of these, so I'm building on their kind of on the back of their efforts and insightful analysis. Some of these analyses have focused on the role that the notion of validation plays in this practice. So for instance, Alexander Ryan Hebron, they propose a general analysis of psychometrics as an epistemic activity. And I think some of the things I say match quite well with kind of the general outline of the logic or kind of the inference in psychometrics. And Rihanna Feast is looking very specifically to the practice of construct validation, linking it to concept development in the social sciences. And while the focus of my analysis doesn't directly touch upon concept development, again, I think there's a lot of continuity between the picture she's providing there of the practice of construct validation and the story I will tell in the remaining time. So, what I want to focus is this sort of critical perspective on what's the role that construct validation procedures, in particular, play in the methods discourse of psychometrics and in psychology more general. Okay, so these are 3 questions I shouldn't forget about in while delivering the remaining of today's talk. I will tell you a bit about what construct validity is supposed to be, how the procedures or set of techniques that stand behind construct validations are justified. And notice I'm kind of switching between validity as a concept and validation. I'm using validation when I'm kind of thinking about What do people do? What are the procedures for validating a construct? So, once we think about these construct validation procedures, can they help bridge the gap between measurement and theory in psychometrics or in psychology more generally? Okay, I said that a title like constructing construct validity would be a bit quirky, so I went for building construct validity. What I want to offer here is kind of a bit of a conceptual analysis and a bit of clarification. What is construct validity and how it kind of plays into historical and kind of recent debates. So the classic and quite general definition is that validity refers to the extent to which the test or instrument measures what it is intended to measure. I'm flagging this general and sort of understanding because I think this general definition of the concept of validity owes a lot to these efforts to build the more specific notion of construct validity. But what happened, and the historical story I want to say, historical narrative, is that the notion of construct validity has been reused in the methods discourse and kind of has supplanted other, kind of substituted other notions of validity, so that for many, construct validity just is validity. So when they say that validity refers to the extent to which the test or instrument measure what's intended to measure, what's captured is something that's at the core of the notion of construct validity. Okay, if you compare this general, and some might say not terribly informative notion of validity with what you find in contemporary validity literature, you see quite a difference, because in contemporary validity literature, there seems to be much less agreement on how validity should be defined. There are different approaches. Some of the most prominent ones include a unifying treatment of validity, where the focus is on the adequacy of inferences that psychologists make based on test scores, like in Messick, or an argument-based approach, and another popular approach, again, quite unifying. Validation is seen as consisting in giving evidence-backed arguments for interpretation of test scores, or the causal approach favored by Borsboom and others, where the idea is that in a valid measurement, the thing to be measured should cause the measurement outcome. So these are some of them. There are many more sort of more specific definitions of validity, or kind of more general. Some see validity as a general umbrella for a very wide set of procedures. And one might say, kind of, some thoughts, some kind of ideas from here might resonate. And you might think, okay, if you have a controversy about validity, and it has been lasted for a while, maybe, and it remains undecided what you should mean by validity, maybe the problem is that there is some ambiguity in the expression, so that the disputants affix different ideas to the terms employed in the controversy. It were impossible if men affix the same ideas to their terms that they could go so long form different opinions of the same subject, especially when they communicate their views and each party turn themselves on all sides in search of arguments which may give them the victory over their antagonists. So I take kind of Hume diagnosis to be here. If they're still disagreeing and we don't know what validity is, it's kind of basically because the conceptual work of clarifying what validity is hasn't been done. Once we do that, and once we clarify what we understand by validity, all these debates and problems around validity should kind of disappear, shouldn't they? I don't take the type of analysis I'm doing in the paper and in the broader project to be necessarily one of conceptual engineering, in the sense of let's redefine the notion of validity. So if not that, then what? So the revolution is not with respect to that. I take the approach to be, I don't know, to kind of just put a label on it, a methods discourse analysis. Kind of looking at the historical development of the concept of validity in psychometrics with the aim of tracing some distinctions in validation procedures and concepts as they were historically introduced in psychometrics, and identifying some commitments and assumptions which have served and continue to serve to justify these distinctions. And also using this type of analysis to challenge how some of these distinctions and justifications, associated justifications, are translated or reflected in the current practice of psychometrics. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I want to focus next. So I started by saying that for many nowadays, construct validity equals validity. But I want to kind of go backwards in time and kind of suggest that actually the introduction of the idea of construct validity and validity theories and procedures has been linked explicitly in the methods discourse with a specific type of concern. So the term construct validity itself was introduced by Cronbach and Mell in the mid-50s in the attempt to address the quality of the increasingly growing number of theoretical psychological concepts whose reference could not be established through clear experimental testing. So there was an increasing number of theoretical concepts like flowing through the air and not sure if they designate something, what's their quality, what's their kind of quality or validity, and establishing what the construct validity concept should stand for can be traced back to 4 seminal papers. And I want to flag the contribution of these papers to the methods discourse in psychometrics next. So the first paper, 1948, argued, so start off with this sort of background concern for the legitimacy of hypothetical constructs. These are understood as concepts of cognitive factual reference, which cannot be reduced solely to the data used to support the postulation of these concepts. So in this paper, it was proposed that hypothetical constructs are best understood as hypotheses about the existence of certain entities, processes, or events that are not directly observed. So what this paper is doing is pushing for psychological theories that describe entities underlying but not equivalent to what's observed or in the lab or measured in different experimental research settings. Second paper, 1955, focuses on the methods and rules of inference for establishing what kinds of things will count as evidence for the validity of measures of these hypothetical constructs. And Cronbach and Mell insisted in 55 that construct validation tests or procedures are to be seen as also tests of the validity of the theory, which specifies the measure's postulated meaning. So there is a push in this second paper for specific theories describing relations among psychological processes as being a key step in the process of evaluating the validity of the measures, or the performance of the measures that we're taking to represent the processes or attributes. Then the third paper is, if taking this a step further, it's kind of thinking about the process of construct validation as a general framework for developing and testing psychological theories, and at the same time, the measures used to represent these hypothetical constructs. So, and one interesting thing that can be observed in this paper, unlike the previous two and the last one, is that Löwiger explicitly takes construct validity to include both what he called content and predictive validity. Why I flag that? Because I think in the current methods discourse, there is kind of this sort of ambiguity sometimes in the practice or kind of in the presentation, in the interpretation of the significance of the measures. So there is a sort of ambiguity about the distinction between predictive and construct validity. And I think this can be traced back to some parts of the historical methods discourse, if not to all of them. So I wanted to also flag that sort of thing. And then the last paper, P1 sets up the more technical aspects, but here I'm kind of trying to formulate them also in qualitative terms of the construct validation process. So, what are the principles, if you want, that should always kind of be instantiated by every sort of technique or method developed to constructively validate some measure. These principles are sort of idea that all measures are construct or trait units, so that variance in psychological measures is going to be determined by construct variance, by variance due to the methods of measurement used and the errors of measurement. Then this paper also kind of pointed out very influential the principle that we need at least 2 types of evidence required to validate psychometric measurements: convergent validity and discriminant validity. I can tell you, I'm seeing I'm running out of time, and I know how many things I want to tell you. So I'm gonna come back to clarify this distinction if it stands in the way of your understanding in Q&A. And they also pointed out that validation studies have to consider simultaneously 2 or more traits being measured by at least 2 different methods. So that is why they kind of thought about this approach to construct validation as multi-trait, multi-method methodology. And this has been very influential in developing specific sort of validation techniques, all these principles. So we can take these seminal papers as establishing these sort of pillars of construct validation methods. So the sort of idea that theory plays a role in measure validation, that validation procedures assume that constructs are somehow wrapped in domain-specific theoretical frameworks. There is also this idea that there is a mutual or perhaps even iterative relation between validation of test measures and validation of theoretical hypotheses. And as I flagged with respect to the third seminal paper, there is some conceptual and practical ambiguity concerning the distinction between predictive and explanatory uses of hypothetical construct. And this relates to the distinction between predictive and constructive validity. So nowadays, this is a distinction, and many philosophers have flagged it, that transpires from the practice between predictive validity. A test is said to be valid if it predicts some outcome or behavior of interest. So you take intelligence tests should predict academic achievement or grades. So for predictive validity, the test results must correlate with some criterion variable thought to be relevant for the target attribute, like intelligence and scholarly achievement. And there's another part of the historical story linking criterion validity to predictive validity, but I promised I'll kind of try to keep my distinctions neat and tidy here. So if predictive validity is that, construct validity is supposed to emphasize, like I tried to show you in the method discourse, the link between between measurement and theory. So a test is said to be valid if there is a theoretical construct which explains the test or the experimental results. So for construct validity, the target attribute or the construct must be embedded in this sort of theoretical framework so that correlational evidence can be used to infer whether or not the proposed measure captures the target attribute. Okay, so assuming that was relatively clear, the construct validity of what? So one push in kind of discussing this notion of construct validity is that many sort of papers within psychometrics and outside, they talk very broadly about validity, but kind of they drop the term kind of construct. So they seem to be using this sort of general notion of validity, and all the sort of tests developed with in accordance with the principles laid out by the seminal papers, kind of target this much more broad and even kind of ambiguous notion of validity. But I think looking at specific cases, one can see distinctions emerging, so sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, between a test having predictive validity or a test having something more than predictive validity. And that's why I think this my cherry picking of cases can be instructive. So if one looks at intelligence, one might say, surely, look, IQ tests appeared early on from a practical concern. So you have Binet considered the problem of children who are not performing successfully in French primary schools. And these early knowledge tests were meant to identify pupils whose levels of general knowledge differed from what was deemed to be age-appropriate abilities. There was no concern for a theory being developed or for a theory backing up this. There was primarily a practical concern predicting, kind of identifying kids and predicting who is going to have certain sort of general knowledge related abilities. So if you take, for instance, one of the most widely used, currently used intelligence tests, like the Peabody picture vocabulary test. This is an IQ test for very young children. It measures word recognitions. The children will point to the correct picture representing the spoken words. Now, results on this test are highly correlated with other tests designed to measure intelligence. And in light of that, it's very often to be said to be a valid measure of intelligence. But one can have quite specific sort of questions that arise from these claims about the validity of the measure. What is the test measuring and by what scale? Is the test showing that vocabulary drives intelligence or that intelligence drives vocabulary? It's unclear how the kind of judgments about the validity of the test can answer these sorts of questions without kind of assuming some sort of more local sort of theory about what is the link between language and general intelligence. And I kind of said it, if not explicitly, implicitly, predictive validity for intelligent tests has like predictive validity for different criteria like scholastic achievement or school grades has been intensively studied, but the same cannot be said to be about the construct validity. And that's not surprising because from early on, intelligence as an ability to learn and think logically was not really kind of a well-defined construct. But granting that this is a kind of historically has been the case and continues to be to some extent, does that mean there are not more specific cognitive hypotheses that can inform valid kind of these tests that try to validate intelligence test scores? So there's this sort of questions that even if the practice is not oriented toward theory development, or for that matter, to the use of theory in validation procedure, whether there is not quite an obvious role for theory to be improving these validation scores. So with your permission, I will kind of steal a bit more time to kind of carry you through a bit, at least very quickly through the examples in my general conclusion. So I kind of bear with me. What motivated actually the project and all this investigation into psychometrics and constability was actually this example. After teaching for 3 years the neuroscience of religion and kind of hearing about how kind of mysticism scale is a good predictor of spirituality, and not only that, but it also kind of explains spirituality, start wondering why the mysticism scale is considered a valid measure of personal sort of spirituality. So and many studies within the kind of trying to achieve these sort of psychometric measures of mysticism and spirituality. So they have been developed. Their predictive sort of validity has been questioned, but what kind of seems to be interesting is that some of these methodological sort of commentaries, there seems to be sometimes explicit again, but more often implicit sort of idea that the mysticism scale is a scale that has constructive validity because it can play role in kind of validating specific theories of spirituality. Again, I can answer more questions about this, but this was kind of the example that motivated me into going. It's like, what is actually happening here? What is it claim? Or it's claimed that this particular kind of measurement scale within psychology is valid and that it can help with theory building in kind of cognitive theories of religion. Okay, finally, I want to point out that with my previous example, there were cases in which one might kind of worry about the relevance of construct validity with respect and its relation to theory, because we don't have theories of general intelligence, we don't have theories of spirituality or of kind of religious cognition. But there are areas of psychological measurement, such as memory, where we have relatively well-developed local theories. So there are local theories or hypotheses, call them if you want, concerning the relation between different types of memory, focus, attention, perception. And these theories predict and explain what happens in particular test scenarios and particular experimental setups. For instance, when participants are asked to report elements in a visual array that's presented in a flash and so on. Moreover, the capacity of short-term memory can be measured in a wide range of experimental setups, in simple and complex span tests that focus on different types of performances that again can be explained in terms of Not all, but often explained in terms of local hypotheses. And many short-term memory tests are validated, both with respect to specific criteria, so it's kind of in the sense of predictive validity, but also relative to these more general or local theories. And I think the case of short-term memory, unlike the other ones, kind of points to a way in which the development and use of hypotheses allows for increasingly complex validation procedures of memory tests. So let me get to the concluding remarks. 2 more minutes. I always do this. So are there any general lessons that I'm trying to draw out of these case studies and the methods discourse that they develop around validation procedures? So one, I take it, if you look at the intelligence test case, you can see that in the absence of theories, both local and general, validation procedures play a limited predictive role, practical role, and in some cases, although I haven't shown this in this talk, risk to remain seen, but also de facto, a narrow technical exercise. But there are also cases in practice where psychometric measurements seem to take the lead on theory development. Again, if you are to take at face value the methods discourse in the cognitive science of religion, and then you have this sort of uses of psychometric measures of mysticism to inform and kind of suggest kind of hypothesis how to understand spirituality and its link to religiosity in cognitive theories of religion. But I think one can kind of be more critical of that particular method of discourse and show how actually these theoretical hypotheses play a role in the development of the psychometric measurements that are said to be valid. And finally, from the short memory case, the sort of lesson that I take is that theoretical hypotheses can support the development of more robust validation procedures, which everyone should want, I know. So the revolution I mentioned is kind of related to this sort of question: how can the validity of psychological measurements be improved? I try to point out that upon a closer inspection of the methodological discourse in psychometrics, one can see that the construct validity, the notion of construct validity or construct validation procedure have been assigned a sort of bridging role between measurement and theory, so that the validation of a test result says something about the validity of the concept assumed as part of a local theory. Now, current psychometric validation practices, if you look across the examples I suggested, or even beyond those, depart to some degree from this type of methodological discourse. But I think that a critical examination of the procedures can reveal this sort of a more insightful picture of how that bridging role could be achieved, namely by increasing the robustness of psychometric measurements, because that will contribute to establishing test validity as well as the validity of the associated theoretical construct. Also, another sort of idea is that the validity of psychometric measurements can be indirectly justified or established based on the development of successful theories that build on these measurements, as in the case of short-term memory. Not sure about the mysticism case, if I would kind of say that we have successful theories. And finally, that the validity of psychometric measurements can be indirectly justified. Oh, sorry. I put it twice. I strongly believe in that. I think one was with respect to the short-term memory kind of practices, and the other one was supposed to say something slightly different. Okay, thank you very much for bearing with me going over time, and I hope kind of might get some questions.
Great, thank you very much for this really nice talk. Let me remind the audience about how we're going to be proceeding. If you have a question, please go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A button, and write your name in the text box. And I will promote you to the panelist status when you do that, and you'll be able to ask your question yourself. So please go downstairs, go to the bottom. I'm starting to confuse online space and real world space. Go to the bottom of your screen and just write your name so that I can promote you and you can ask your question. All right, so while you are doing that, I'll get the discussion going. So I think I agree with a lot of things of what you said. On the other hand, what is also striking from a sociological point of view, not necessarily from from a sociological point of view, is the fact that psychometrics remains quite marginal in mainstream psychology. And it has become sort of an issue in the replication crisis over the last 5 years, because for various reasons, but one of them is the lack of the poor quality of measurement is contributing to the low replication. And indeed, some personality psychologists have noted that many of the measures that are used, in fact, a very large majority of the measures that are used in psychology are never validated at all, or their validation is extremely superficial. They just compute the reliability using kappa, for example, or sometimes omega. And so it's actually a very superficial way of validating the measure. So there's a sort of I don't know, tension, but a surprising disconnect between somehow what you're describing and the actual status of psychometrics, which is a very niche discipline in the broader psychology. So can you just, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, it's interesting. Kind of, I think last time I gave this talk, it was that was exactly the first question. So it definitely kind of taps into. So my answer would be that basically part of the need for the revolution is to kind of the message would be, without construct validation, these applications, potential application of psychometrics to scientific psychology are not going to get off the ground, because the other types of validation that you have with these measures are kind of are these sort of technical sort of exercise that doesn't translate into. So the idea is like, oh, go back to the methodological discourse and see from the beginning, the idea was to come up with a notion of validation that links theory and measurement, and make sure that the measures you develop are kind of developed on the basis of our best background theories. The practice has kind of deviated from that. We kind of arrived in psychometrics to have this sort of technical exercises of developing statistical models that we then cannot apply, that have some sort of validity, but that's not the type of validity we're kind of interested in. So part of this is kind of, okay, there was in the methods discourse the push for this within psychometrics. Then something happened in the practice, so we kind of arrived at this sort of kind of current status of psychometrics with respect, but that need not be kind of, the status quo that we should kind of accept and just say, oh, let's do this. We can, so the idea would be there might be kind of quite fruitful things to be developed if psychometrics is kind of embedded. And that's why, I mean, if you lead with the example of short-term memory, you can kind of show something more productive. If you lead with the example of intelligence, you kind of end up kind of, say like, yeah, this is what, intelligence is, what this tests say, and what this test say is not very informative or very useful, or, and you kind of go in criticizing psychometrics. So it kind of matters kind of a bit the area where you look at. But as you say, I mean, kind of psychologically, sociologically, that's kind of the landscape you observe. And my point about the revolution is that we can kind of contribute by this kind of critical analysis and by focusing on validation procedures to maybe rethinking the role of psychometrics within scientific psychology.
Yeah, I'll follow up after, but Colin has joined us. Colin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for the talk. And this, in a way, follows on from Edouard's question. I mean, psychometrics is often its own particular space. And of course, one of the worries about psychometric test validation is it's kind of a circular enterprise. So your test is validated if it kind of correlates, if the results from it correlate well with other people's tests in this same space. And I think the example of working memory is both similar and different in important ways. So it's similar that if you, sorry, it's,
yeah, you cut at it's similar and different, and then you cut. We can't hear you, Colin. You want to log off and log?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hold on. Yeah, good. Okay, sorry, I've been having trouble with these earbuds. They just drop out and mute automatically without my doing anything. So if you go to working memory, then if you focus narrowly on working memory capacity, then of course you can validate a bunch of tests for working memory capacity that cross-correlate. So it has a similar worry with circularity, except what people have been finding in the working memory literature is, in fact, your assessments of capacity are highly task dependent. So depending on the nature of tasks, you'll get really different measures of working memory capacity. We also have in working memory a history going back to the 1960s of people developing process models, something more like theories, right? Whereas in the psychometrics, there's no process modeling at all. It's all just statistical massaging of test results, right, to find common factors. But even within the process modeling world, it's sort of understood, I think, at this point that some of the other features of the system that have to do with things like robustness to interference and all these other things, which don't give you then different measures of the same thing. They rather give you a more complex picture of the set of mechanisms that are involved in producing these phenomena across a range of different tests that actually give you different answers for capacity. So I'm wondering if you could, whether you think there's really hope that in the psychometrics world, that kind of sort of mechanistic process modeling, and I hear I'm munging sort of two levels in the sense that the process models are a level of abstraction above neural mechanisms, but there, there's a story to be told there as well. Is there any hope in the psychometrics world that we can get beyond just sort of the circular cross-test validation to something that really is theoretically process oriented?
So I think that, if you're stuck to understanding psychometrics as the technical discipline in which, I'm not tied to the interpretation of this construct and it's all about kind of developing these sort of, then no, but that's why I kind of flagged, in a way, that it was in the spirit of psychometrics being set up as being sort of applicable and kind of not only in direct conversation, but it kind of as another way of testing these quite specific hypotheses at different levels of abstraction. So I think if you are willing, and I don't think all psychometricians would be willing because that's a kind of, they are kind of caught up in a special type of exercise, but if you're willing, I think with respect to, with working memory and short-term memory, there are areas where there might be more fruitful interactions, but again, assuming that you're willing to not necessarily go back to Cronbach and Mell and see, in their methods discourse, they established that psychometry should be this, but kind of looking there back and see, that was a kind of a more ambitious project for psychometrics that we kind of revive a bit also kind of the status of psychometrics as an empirical discipline, not only as a sort of exercise. So I think definitely in some areas are kind of more fruitful for developing this, but it's always kind of conditional on this. Let's give up certain assumptions about what the field should be doing and kind of open up to how do we test kind of a model that is a process level versus a model that's kind of more mechanistic in the sense of kind of specifying a bit more causes, kind of a more causal type of modeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Colleen. Sherife, floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Maria, for the great talk. I was just kind of thinking and writing about operationalism earlier today, so your talk was like really timely. I was just going to ask you, because you worked in kind of different contexts of instrumentalizing constructability, how you see the relationship between the constructs we develop and their connection to actual practice and outcomes, and is that so? And I think when I look at the clinical psychiatry context, there's lots of self-rating scales, for instance, for the effectiveness of medications and so on and so forth. And in those constructs, they're entirely, we care about measuring the phenomena that we're representing, but we're also more interested in how well that measurement kind of goes with the particular question that we're trying to answer. So can you kind of speak a little bit about how do you see that in relation to kind of theory development and kind of maybe progress in psychology and science?
So, okay, that's a very broad picture. I don't know if I can paint it all. But one issue that it kind of interests me, and I didn't get kind of the chance to specify. So if this more fruitful relationship between like psychological theories and psychometrics is to work out, I think what we also need is to have some picture of, let's call them causal mechanism, because I'm kind of strapped for other metaphors or ideas of how the measurement works. So just like when you go and measure temperature and you kind of have an idea of, you know, how the thermometer works, so that it's kind of, so you need to also understand if you're under causal influence of your instruments in kind of generating certain measures. And I think especially with respect to kind of self-reports, questionnaires and things like that. So when I kind of started looking at the mysticism scale and I was looking at the question and I was like, so what do you assume is the causal process that you get certain results, and then you consider these results to be evidence for a theory of the phenomenon, given that, so there seem to be, so I think in the terms of like in terms of the construct development, there is a sort of missing link, like how do we think these measurements procedures capture something about the attribute, and then how that links back to kind of the theory. Because I think, you know, very often in psychometrics literature, there is very little, if any, discussion about these causal mechanisms that kind of link the measurements to the measurement procedure to the measurements that we have, and then to link those to the theory. And I think, I mean, if we would have that, then definitely I think our construct would be better. Probably progress would be much slower because we have to understand so many different things. But I agree that like there are some steps in this. So for instance, when I like the model that Liana Fest is kind of, when she's thinking about construct validation, and she's saying like, look, we come with this lumpy construct with these partial constructs, and we keep kind of adding to them, and it's fine if we don't have construct validation that's kind of saying this is the best and so on. So it's kind of, it's a process that keeps adding. And so I think that general pictures of how concepts get developed and how theory can kind of influence measurement, it's something I would definitely kind of subscribe to. But I would want something that's a bit more detail over the steps. You know, I like that, like in some of your papers, you present this sort of nice diagrams and present these are the kind of the things that need to be linked. So I want something like that when I'm explaining the link between measurement and theory in psychometrics. I want to have this sort of diagram. This is what we need. We need to understand how the measurement techniques affect or cause the measurement results, and how the theory affects that. And if we put that, we might not kind of have direct guidelines for practice, but at least we'll have a better understanding of what's the difficulty of bringing these together.
That's great. Thank you.
Makes sense.
Thanks, Sharifi, for joining us. And I noticed we have 3 former postdocs of the center on the screen, which is pretty remarkable. Reed, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for the very nice talk. I was wondering, so something that I think I see often in psychometrics is that once something is measured, a skill, so sorry, not some, once something is measured, once a skill is built, they do some, indeed, they calculate reliability, they calculate some correlation with other tests, and then the test is standardized and it stays sort of fixed. So the measurement doesn't change anymore over time. And yet at the same time, I think what you would want is that as you learn more about the construct and your theories develop, and that in some way informs again how we measure these things. But so my first question is, do you also recognize this? Do you see this, or do you think, no, this link actually goes quite well? And if not, do you think there's a way to improve that?
Yeah, so I don't think the link the link goes well. So I think there is exactly the problem you described. So you get some tests, some measures becoming the golden standard for measuring ability X. And then because, so my efforts in this sort of historical analysis to show that makes sense, because if you look at the history of psychometrics, you see that you had criterion validity being established first, and a lot of effort being put into that, and then predictive validity being built upon criterion validity, and construct validity being built upon that. And because of the way the practice has been built, this idea that there is a golden standard hasn't been properly challenged. So when Liliana Fest is saying that there are these iterative steps so that you can kind of you come up with a kind of lumpy construct, and that you test in you try to measure in a particular test, but then you can kind of come with a better theory. I think that normatively that should happen. I think very rarely it happens in the actual practice. And my push is, look, if we make enough noise about the methodological problems that are here, kind of there should come an increasing acknowledgement that there is this missing step, as you say, that there should be a bit more flexibility with respect to what counts as, I mean, they should be seen as standard, but not so much as golden standards, especially if you want to live up to this role that construct validity is linking theory and measures, because linking kind of goes both ways. I mean, in the statements of Cronbach and Mell, it was all about how you use one to validate the other and vice versa. I mean, if you want the vice versa, make sure that the tests are kind of standard, but not as in stone as they are set very much nowadays in practice. So that's why, I mean, with my term revolution, so changes need to be made in how you understand kind of the methodology if you are to allow for this theory to play a really substantive role in the validation procedures. Otherwise, there's going to be more, let's come with other methods for kind of estimating error and things like that. But I agree it's a problem. I don't know. I don't think I have this sort of very general approach to acknowledging it as a problem and how it might be brought to attention with respect to specific cases rather than kind of practical, saying to people what they should do. But I would.
Yeah. So I fully agree with what you're saying. But do you have something in mind already as how methodology could change to allow for such flexibility, or?
So my point would be about this. Look, if we are kind of lumping together all notions of validity into one, then we'll end up considering that validity is just, that sort of battery test is kind of making sure the correlations. So it would be kind of via this sort of methods or methodological discourse pointing out that there might be more to the requirements to construct validate. So if you set construct validation as a more, and again, reflecting what was the historical sort of program, say like, look, it should be more. This is the sort of thing you should be doing. And if you want to do this, you need to open the gates for theory to play this sort of revisionary role with respect to the tests that you develop for specific measures. But that's, I know it's kind of general, but that would be the path, kind of via the methods discourse, if you want.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Reid, for joining us. I have a question from James Mara, and I'm going to read it for you because he didn't want to join us as a panelist. So studies are appearing that employ terror management theory. So do you know TMT, terror management theory? And the point of that theory is to explain some social behavior, namely risky public displays to political ideologies. For example, anti-masking demonstrations. And I think the idea roughly is when you're reminded of your death, you get more conservative or something. Anyway, TMT explains this by referring to the to cognitive processes, or what they would call mortality salience. James Mara says there is much in the literature that's concerned with construct validation in that context. And he wants to know whether you have any thought on this research program.
Yeah, no, no, with the exception of the fact that I would want to know, kind of understand more what is kind of the feedback loop there. So how kind of the question of validation is asked in that case. So is it because sometimes there is a sort of because of the umbrella term of validation, there can be a focus, because it's two directional, it can be a focus on the validating of the theory or on validating of something that's kind of being measured, so kind of some test results. So I would need to know much more about debate to see kind of if the focus of kind of the validation debate, whether something is validated, is the measure taking, as kind of Rita saying, kind of the standard, and then you're trying to validate something about the background theory or whatever, or is it the other way around? You're trying to validate certain measures because you think you have support for these sort of cognitive theories. But I wouldn't know. I don't have any pronouncements because I know very little about that sort of background debate.
Great. And I think we're reaching the end of the Q&A. So thank you very much, Maya, for joining us. It's been really a really good talk and a great topic of research. And thanks to all of you for also joining us, and for those of you who joined us for the Q&A. And thanks again.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Edward, and thank you everyone for coming. Bye-bye.
Take care.